there were several who got to spend some time with Connie Adams this Lord's Day, of course, here, but then at Jeff and Joy's at lunchtime. And it's funny, I mentioned we were studying out of this book, and I said it's the book of one another's, and I couldn't remember the name of it. And it was in my car. I couldn't remember to go get that either. Building up one another. And Wilson Adams, of course, being the author, and Connie goes, I don't know anything about this book. He acted as though he never. I said, well, you basically taught right out of it for the study hour this past Lord's Day, and he acted like he didn't even know this book existed. So in his case, it was just pretty much up in his head. I have to write things down that he doesn't have to write down. We left our last time study together last week, Wednesday, where Andrew had posed a question. I'm going to ask him to ask the question again for our consideration. Yes, I'm going to do that to you.
We had talked about the unity and working together and having one agenda, and we had talked about how we need to focus on the big ideas that drive the little things, not hyper-focusing on the little things that we take issue with. What are the big ideas that should drive and iron out the little things that give us so many problems? So my question was, what are actually some of those big unifying ideas?
I like the question because I think there's several ways you can approach it. Maybe some the way that Andrew intended by the way he asked the question, and maybe not. So I want us to look at the question itself just a little bit. What are the big ideas? I think Andrew used the word last week. What are the big unifying things that we fall back on is what I wrote down. Meaning, what are those things that are reliable in our being a like-minded people, a people of interest in building up one another? What are those unifying things? And he said, if you made a list, what would be on the list? Now, Margaret, I don't see Margaret. Yes, she is. You're not back hiding on the spot. Margaret said that, well, she had all the answers from what Connie said, so I'm expecting to hear from Margaret to recap that for us, too. What did you think the big unifying things were? Okay.
And the second was to love your neighbor, to bear one another's burdens. And then there are various ways discussed that you can do that, to receive one another, and he explained very clearly the meaning of that, to show hospitality, and to stir up one another to good works.
Okay, I think that was the outline. Yes, I would agree. Are these the big things that unify us? Or are there other things that unify us? What are the foundational thoughts of Christian living that hold us together, or that we are the default setting, maybe, to use it in a different phrase?
Maybe too general, but I think one of the singular defining things that is non-negotiable has to be a willingness to know and to apply the Word of God. I mean, if we can agree on that, there may be a host of things even that we may consider to be doctrinally foundational that it takes you or I some time to come to an understanding of. But if we can both agree on a commitment to strive to know what God's will is, and upon knowing it to apply it to the best of our ability, that I think can unify us across a whole host of things that we may have some struggles on and have to work toward coming to agreement or into closer union on in some of those things than others. So I think if we've got that one, there are a lot of areas we can work through and get where we need to be in these other aspects.
So recognizing the authority of God and recognizing that his revealed word is the authority that we have in our possession. Have men and women probably also sat down and tried to make this list of foundational things in the past? I think it's been attempted many, many times. And what are the advantages and what are the pitfalls of that? Maybe that's why I'm not getting the kind of contribution I'm expecting. What are some of the pitfalls of that? We get something on the list, and then you say, well, I'm not sure I can hold to that one. That's one that I would scratch, calling that a foundation. Do we think we can know what these things are, or is it shifting? Is this a one-time list for all time, or is this a shift is this a list that's malleable or changes with time?
I think if we're calling these things foundational, they shouldn't be shifting or easy to change. They need to be something that can be relied on. I do think that maybe at different times we could dwell on different ones, or maybe shift our focus to different ones that we need to be reminded of. One that I was trying to figure out the wording that I wanted to say for it. Because what I was trying to do was, for any of these, just ask why. Well, why is that true, or why is that true? And kind of back up the ladder. Margaret said we ought to love one another. Well, why? Why is it important to love one another? Or Grace said to use and agree to use the word of God. Well, why? And I guess trying to get foundational, that the truth that there is a God and that he wants to redeem everyone. And if that's true, then I can use that principle to say, well, it helps me remember my place, because it helps me remember that I've been redeemed, that I needed redeeming. And so there's times where I need to remember that I shouldn't approach someone with too much pride, or approach something pretending like I know it all, because I had to be redeemed too. But it also helps in reaching someone else who's in sin, because I know that there's a God who made them and that he wants them to be redeemed as well. So the same truths don't change, but depending on what I need to use them for, I can focus on a different aspect of it that might help me.
Okay. In working together, in finding ways to build each other up, I think we do have a little stumble when we try to put down on paper what is this list of things that are universally unified. I think Margaret's list, or Connie's list, whichever one you want to say, is an excellent place to go. Loving God and loving your neighbor as you would like to be loved, or loving your neighbor as yourself, says the same thing. Upon these hang all the law and the prophets. Now, was there never any disagreement over the law of Moses and how it was applied? Well, they battled and fought over those kind of things all the time. Are there passages in the Bible that we find inconsistencies on in how we agree? So, making a list is not the goal. It's, at least for me, making a list for you to follow is not my goal. But for me not to have, as Andrew said, a reason to understand why I think that the Bible is the Word of God. That's a foundation upon which I need to stand. A reason to understand why I need to love my neighbor. And why I need to love God. Because God loved me first. Because my neighbor's created in the image of God. If I can't to my own satisfaction, make that list of foundational go-tos, then I think when it comes to the eating of meats and how long you wear your hair and some of these things that churches have divided over, probably those divisions actually existed more along the lines of not knowing how to be agreeable with people when you disagree with what they believe. When it's a matter of opinion, when it's a matter of application. The application may be different, the principle may be the same. I was reading a fellow today. If I say who it is by his position, you might know who this is and you might not. But he was writing as one who has recently been, I don't know if it was by his choice, I don't think it was, but he was considered one of the leaders, if not the president, of the Southern Baptist Synod in the United States. And he said he's been hearing from other men around the country who have been preaching the gospel and preaching Matthew 5, preaching the Beatitudes. And he says he's been told that after a lesson on the Beatitudes, he's had members come up and challenge, well, where are you getting this ideology from? What do you mean turn the other cheek? That's a sign of weakness. That's not who we are when we're strong. And he said the guys would react, I'm literally just reading what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. Well, your ideology is woke. We can't tolerate this stuff. We don't want to hear it. Well, you're not going to have any opportunity to accept one another if you're just going to take those foundational ideas that Jesus laid down as what true religion looks like. If you're going to say that's an ideology that conflicts with my political agenda or my worldview, you're not going to find unity there. So there has to be both the ability to ascertain what needs to be on my list and what needs to be on your list, and find ways to justify those things that we think are foundational from the scriptures. And if we're not going to that resource, then it's subjective and it's going to be problematic when we have disagreements. Yes, ma'am.
When I was younger and went to Dove Camp, we would have a lot of discussions. There was a lot of downtime where girls could just get together and study different things. And it became this like common phrase of, is that a salvation issue? We would talk about the hair covering and instrumental music and taking the communion once a week and all these things. And it's like, well, is it a salvation issue? And I think we have to kind of boil down our actions and how we approach the Bible. Is it a salvation issue? Because salvation is what saves us. And without salvation, we couldn't have a relationship with God. And so if we take everything, we make everything this huge decision, and we say, oh, well, you have to follow this super long list to be for salvation. Well, that's not really what the New Testament's about. Jesus abolished the long list of rules that we're supposed to follow. And so I think it's important to boil things down to, what do we need to do for that salvation?
So I think two good points there. One is we're not saved by perfect works to start with. And as Christians, we are going to constantly struggle with, but we do believe there are things that are foundational. But it's not the perfect keeping of law that saves us. We understand that. So we've got this this range, these two poles by which most subjects fall somewhere between those two poles. But I think the other thing too is if someone else needs to spell out for me all the things that so that I know what it is that's a salvation issue. If someone's got to make the list for me, that may be more a sign of my spiritual laziness than it is the fact that we need a list in order to work in commonality. And if it's the majority or a great number of people who feel more comfortable with being told what the list is than reasoning and working out their own salvation for themselves, then I think that's when you just get dogmatism, and that leads to dividing over things that are because that's been on the list for generations, and now you're telling me it's not on the list mentality, as opposed to, am I looking at this from the standpoint of looking to please God and to serve one another? You know, and if my list doesn't accomplish at least those two things, then I don't know that I've got the right priorities for my list. There's a lot of ways to introduce areas of conflict that are unnecessarily introduced because of egos, because of complacency, because of lots of reasons that are human frailties. I mean, we just have to be honest with ourselves. If it wasn't for human frailties and us wanting to go our own direction, we wouldn't struggle so much with being able to work together toward the same end. And so because of that complexity of looking at those two poles of it doesn't really matter versus I need to follow God's law perfectly or I'm condemned, which is impossible, we're told. Somewhere in the middle needs to be our faith, and it needs to be with foundational matters that are more important than details of opinion and culture and history. And that's going to take work. That's going to take a intellectual investment. Joy.
I'm really glad that Liz brought that up because that is on the top of my list, and I was thinking that was too simple to say. So, for me, it is salvation. That is the most important thing for me and for as many others as possible. And it is possible to blow that. I have to know that I'm not once saved, always saved. I can blow it. So I don't want to do that. The other thing is pleasing God. So if there's opinions and discrepancies and divisions and things like that, is that pleasing God? No, it's not pleasing God. But even if we don't see it exactly the same way, if it gets to the point where, there gets to be arguing and all that kind of drama, that's not pleasing God. So for me, these are the two standards. I have to do salvation and pleasing God.
Yeah, I'm not going to criticize any doctrinal matter that's on your list as a foundational matter when it comes to salvation and pleasing God. These are clear that there's no dispute. And yet, in our culture today, we are having people who claim to be evangelical Christians that are disputing fundamental teachings of Jesus. And I don't see how they can be unified with true believers when they're rejecting the source of salvation. Andrew.
I need to think more.
That is a balk, and I get to take second base now because of that. All right. I'm going to I'm sorry. Go ahead, Aaron.
When Andrew started this, he asked, what are the core things that unify us? And I really think that when you look at what unifies people, it's having a common values-driven mission. And so if you have a good leadership that has a good mission and you have solid values, that should unify everybody. We don't have to agree on, some of the tactical stuff, but we have to agree on what is the values and the purpose of, for lack of a better term, the organization.
How about citizenship as a term? In terms of a framework, a legal framework of, if you're going to be a citizen, you must be subject to certain laws of the kingdom. There's just no getting around it, or suffer the consequences, either one. So I think there has to be a respect for some matter of organization around our thoughts on how we approach what are the fundamental matters. I'm sure many of you may have read the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed or other creeds that have been written over history. Have you ever gone through any of those and thought, well, check, X? Have you ever done that with any of those doctrines? Brace, do you find yourself in agreement with more than half of the Nicene Creed? I can't either. Now, I have yet to find one and say, that does it for me. But you and I are not laying the Nicene Creed and down in front of people and saying sign on the bottom. Why not? Do we know what's on the list? Would the Nicene Creed be a reasonable starting point for my list? I don't see why not either. And I've come to that conclusion independent of Brace. I assumed he'd read it. I assumed that I was going to expect high 90s, depending on what you thought of maybe one or two lines. But I expected that you would be in general agreement with most all that it says. And so maybe when you talk about this framework, this organization, there are things that we consider beyond dispute that allow us to sit and commune as brethren. And there are things that Brace and I disagree on, and we are still able to sit down and commune as brethren. Knowing that, and having discussed some of these things out and saying, well, maybe you'll see it my way one day, maybe I'll see it your way, we leave it at that, and that's okay. And those are great conversations. Now, that's not a fixation either. It's not a fixation on my part to try to kind of poke and prod and see where everyone's list is and try to get it aligned as close to mine as I can. But the truth is, I think that each one of us should have in mind these things that are non-negotiable for me and who I fellowship with. You have other thoughts? Okay. Want to make sure I wasn't cutting you off.
More simplistic, what is the one goal for this organization? Save souls. Mm-hmm. And to keep the souls that are saved in the organization. And so if we can't do that, if that hinders our work of saving other people or keeping people in this organization, then that's
going to be in violation of the law of loving your neighbor. If you can't agree on how to talk to your neighbor, how are you going to show any deference or love for them in their soul's condition?
Just to kind of go along with that, you'd asked a couple classes ago, what's the framework? The framework is the Bible. I mean, there should be no other question. The framework's the Bible. And then in saying that, we've talked about what is biblical versus tradition. And Acts 17:11 talks about when Paul was in Thessalonica, and it says in the second half, they searched the scriptures daily to find out if these things were so. We need to be doing that to find out if this is tradition or if this is actually biblical. And if we're not willing to search the scriptures daily and we just go along with tradition, and I guess maybe for lack of a better term, we're stubborn of not searching the scriptures, that's not going to save souls. That's not going to bring people to God, bring people to this church. It's not going to save souls.
And I think simplistically, you probably want to add, it's not going to allow us to grow individually either. If we come to a stagnation point and say, I've made my list and I don't need to think about it anymore, or I don't need to be constantly evaluating myself against that which I've said I hold to be true. And I think this is one of those real cautions. When I mentioned earlier, those that are chastising someone who's preaching from Matthew chapter 5 and quoting Jesus, saying, where are you getting this ideology from? They're going to profess, oh, I'm all about Christ. I'm all, and we've been told people are going to say, you'll honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. You're not willing to do that which I have commanded because you're not showing love for me. And it is too easy a trap to say, oh, I love God and I love Jesus, but then disregard what they have to say for us. People are able to do that exercise too easily. Andrew says he honors his dad, and then he ignores everything we talk about. I don't feel very honored by that.
I remembered what I wanted to say, and it feels like a better time to say it now. If we can get in our minds what these core, you use the word non-negotiable things are, those are the things that stay in your heart. Those are the things that dwell in your heart and actually impact your choices and your actions and where you fall on the little details. And they're the things that allow us to survive conflict. If you think everything is a hard and fast list, and I know exactly the answer on everything where I am on my list, then you're not going to survive conflict because someone else's list doesn't look like yours. But if you think every little thing on your list is non-negotiable, then you're not going to negotiate with anyone. You're not going to make peace with anyone. Liz's point about some of the things that get discussed, how many people, the Bible doesn't put an inch value on hemlines, but how many people have tried? How many people have said 31 inches, 32 inches, 60 inches? I don't know if anyone's got legs that long, but so many people, 2 fingers, 2 knuckles, so many rules that we've all heard that people have come up with where they try to draw a hard and fast line on something that is subjective. And we shouldn't shy away from the term subjectivity. We think, oh, everything's objective. Everything is objective with Scripture, and we can objectively know exactly where. There's no objective command that God has given there. It's subjective, and we shouldn't be afraid to admit that. And if we can say there are things that are subjective, but I know the things that are at its core true, then it helps us to survive so much of the conflict that people divide over.
You raised one last thing, and then I'm going to drop this because we're 30 minutes into this question, and I was going to get into lesson 6, and it's not happening yet. Unfortunately, we're also in a time in American life when a great number of the population of this country cannot discern between what is fact and what is opinion. And you can craft tests and polls that demonstrate the two concepts, and people struggle with thinking, well, if Margaret has an opinion about Jell-O, it must be a fact that it's the greatest dessert since Jell-O. And that'd be Margaret's opinion. But again, people just don't have the ability to discern and say, well, that's one person's judgment, and she's more than welcome to appreciate boiled bones and whatever and put flavoring in it. That's her thing if she wants to do that. And I'm not a Jell-O guy. So, but people today are struggling with the logical process of knowing the difference between those two. And so I stand up here in the class, or I stand in the pulpit, or others stand in the pulpit, and I'm spouting opinions all the time. And I tell you that. I've told you, I am opinionated. And I have to really pull hard sometimes to keep my opinions to myself. But if you don't even have the judgment to know when I'm feeding you the truth and when I'm feeding you an opinion, then how are you going to know what's foundational? I think that there's real intellectual work here. It's not difficult, and it's not outside of our grasp. And I just want to make sure I leave with that this whole question about the list was to me an exercise about how you make the list, not what's on the list. I hope you have concluded that. But in that exercise, it's easy to get junk on there and not realize it because of pride, because of intellectual complacency. There are ways to get contorted over people who disagree with you when you shouldn't have to, because you haven't made the list for yourself in a way that differentiates between fact and opinion, between fact and fiction, between what is integral to God and what is something that is subject to our application and how we apply a principle. And I think every time you read the Proverbs, or every time you do a study of the Proverbs, you probably hear this. These are truisms. What's a truism, Brace? What is a truism? Something is generally is true. What did you just say that implies something else? What did you say that implies another truth? Yeah. And as people of the 21st century, we're comfortable with that. I'll repeat it because we didn't mic you. A truism is generally true, but that implies that there can be exceptions. Don't have to be, but there can be exceptions to a general rule or a general truth. Is Proverbs still inspired? Yes, it is. It's still inspired, and it's still valuable for living and learning. But it's a set of truisms that it's not always going to turn out that way. The first commandment with promise is to live what? Honor your parents and do what? Live a long life. And that's a generalism. That's not a promise. That's generally true because you generally stay out of trouble when you listen to your folks. At least you suffer much fewer burns on the stovetop that way, if nothing else. Much less scarring. All right. Anything else on this conversation? If not, we're just going to spin the wheel and go to lesson 6. Try to get into this a little bit tonight and then visit it more this coming Lord's Day. Confusion reigns about the local church and the role it plays in the life of a Christian is the first sentence here from Wilson. Sadly, some influenced by the world have come to see it as a man-made institution, sort of a spiritual country club. Why do people see it that way? Because of abuses of practice, because of disregard for foundational truth, because of disagreements and divisions over things that are subjective. That leads people to say, but if this church of yours was not an institution of man, there's only one other source of authority for it. It's got to be an institution of God. Ha, I got you. Would God's institution act this way? Would God's institution bicker and fight over little nothing things like that? Would God's institution lead people to doubting themselves all the time and being in fear of leadership of the church that they may step out of line and get stepped on? Would God's institution treat people that way? And you know, when people of the world reason that way, they're right. They're using sound judgment. If they can look at a group of people and see a bunch of miserable infighting and a bunch of division and cliques and a failure to honor one another, and they conclude that the author of this cannot be God, they've made a righteous discernment. Why would they want to be part of that? Have you never heard people who have used, it may not be the reason, but it makes a pretty handy excuse. Well, I can't go to that church because it's what? We've all heard it. It's just full of those hypocrites because they say one thing and they do another. Yeah, I do that too. I try not to do it consistently, but I do it. I try to change if I see it or someone points it out to me. But the point is, you know, the way we come across as the true church is if we're going to represent the divine, we've got to have a little divinity in the way we treat one another. We are the body of Christ, the pillar and support of the truth, 1 Corinthians 12. A shining city on a hill, 1 Timothy 3:15. All these things I said, there's nothing to be desired. There's no lamp to look towards to cast light if that lamp is a local body of infighting, divided people who can't even agree amongst themselves on how to get along with each other. The church is just ordinary people like you and me, people who gather for worship and fellowship. Hebrews 10:24, let us consider how to stimulate or encourage one another to love and good works. The emphasis is not here on attendance keeping. The emphasis, the point of this passage is on considering how to stimulate one another to love and good works, and follows up with the same phrase, stimulating one another to love and good works, all the more as you see the day approaching. There's some dispute on how to decide what that day is, which day we're talking about. I think it's in context, but others may not. I just think it's odd that the Hebrew writer says we have to consider how to encourage one another. And to me, that means you got to find ways that work for different audiences and different personalities. But it's not getting your check in the attendance book. It's being an active part of the assembly and being an active part of being in one another's lives. And I agree that's an important aspect of the assembly, but that's not the extent of our relationship one with another. There's not enough time in the week for that to be true. There's just not enough time in the week for that to be the extent of our relationship. Let us consider how. Maybe I take a different approach. Maybe it's the word of encouragement that sounds a little different to a young Christian than does one who's been around a few years. Maybe it's finding ways to make connections between what goes on here when we're together and what goes on through the week in a person's life. Ephesians 5:19 says we're to speak to one another, making melody with our heart. You look at the actual structure of Ephesians 5:19. It does say that the mechanism is singing psalms and spiritual hymns and spiritual songs, but that word for singing is pluck or vibrate, and you could easily insert the word stimulate there, and you'd have really Ephesians 5:9 read the same. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns, stimulating and making melody with your heart to the Lord. The instrument is not the vocal cords. The instrument here of stimulation is the mind. And the subject is one another. This act of worship is not the mouthing of spiritual songs. It is the interaction, it is the interplay of us being in a community of believers who are taking poetry set to music, and we're reciting that poetry in unison in such a way to encourage one another to think about what it is the songs mean. And for our heart to be strummed or plucked or vibrated. That's what the Greek says, so that we are an instrument of influence on one another. That's what Ephesians 5:19 is talking about. Those are the things that we do when we're together. Acts 20, verse 7, Wilson ties in also as those things that we do to edify and strengthen each other. And that's the communion of the breaking of bread. We do it together, Acts 20, verse 7 talks about. We do this together. The emblems themselves are one thing, but it's the method of being together while we remember our Lord and his sacrifice, and why we take this breaking of bread together. What a communal meal means to us socially is the same context in which it means that for us on a Sunday morning when we're assembled on the first day of the week for this purpose. There is something about breaking bread together that is a community, a sharing with other people. It's the conversation during the meal. You all sit and eat fried chicken in silence. No one says a word to another. You haven't broke bread. You just ate. There's a difference. And these are things that we do together that make us part of that community. Wilson concludes in the third paragraph, God knew what he was doing when he called believers to be part of a local assembly. What do you think of this? I guess this is a metaphor, a word picture. What do you think of this metaphor here, this word picture? What happens to the single log that was lit in a nicely organized fire pit with plenty of fuel, and then you drag it off by itself? That one log will just die out, goes out. And so is spiritual fervor, so is spiritual heat. Separate from the others, there's not really much chance of being on fire. Whew. I managed to get through page 31 in the workbook in introduction. Let's pick up with this discussion of Romans 15 verse 7 on page 32, and we'll see how far we get with the lesson from there. All right. Thank you very much for all your help.